The voice came again, cutting through the howling wind like a ghost from his past. Bryn. He stopped dead in his tracks, ice crystals stinging his eyes. 6 years. 6 damn years since he'd heard another human voice call his name, and now his mind was playing tricks on him. Had to be. The isolation was finally getting to him, just like it had gotten to Martinez before he'd taken that long walk into the storm without his gear. Bryn shook his head hard, trying to clear it. The wind was just wind, nothing more, nothing less. He pulled his salvage pack higher on his shoulder, wincing as the strap dug into a bruise that had been there for weeks. The weight of his meager supplies felt heavier today, like everything else on this frozen wasteland of a planet. Snow whipped across his face in sharp, tiny needles that felt like broken glass against his exposed skin. Even through his thick hood, the cold found ways to bite at him. Navarra 7 didn't mess around when it came to weather. The planet had 2 seasons, brutal winter and slightly less brutal winter. Right now, they were deep in the brutal part, and this storm was working up to be one of the worst he'd seen in months. The kind that could bury a man alive if he wasn't careful. The old mining rail line stretched out before him like the skeleton of some massive beast. Rusted metal beams jutted up from the snow at odd angles, their surfaces coated with ice so thick it looked like glass. Scattered around the rails were the remains of freight cars and mining equipment, picked clean by scavengers like himself over the years. Most of the good stuff was long gone, but sometimes, just sometimes, you could find something the others had missed. Bryn's boots crunched through the frozen debris as he walked. Shattered pieces of polymer and metal scraps littered the ground, mixed with chunks of slag that had probably been sitting here since the mines closed down. The air tasted sharp and metallic, with that familiar bite of ozone that always seemed to hang around the ruins. Behind him, the wind caught in the hollow spaces of the broken structures, creating sounds that his tired brain kept trying to turn into voices, whispers, calls, sometimes even laughter. He'd learned to ignore them mostly. The mind did strange things when it got lonely enough. The central dome was still 30 kilometers away, a full day's journey in good weather, maybe 2 in this mess. He was out here on pure instinct now, following routes he'd memorized over years of scavenging. There wasn't much left worth finding in this sector, but he kept coming back anyway. Maybe he was hoping for a miracle. Maybe he was just too stubborn to admit defeat. Or maybe he was slowly going crazy, just like everyone else who'd tried to make a living on this dead rock. The freight tunnel appeared out of the white void just as the last traces of daylight faded behind the storm clouds. Navarre's sun was dying anyway, had been for the last 1,000 years, according to the old mining records, and what little light it gave off was pretty much useless by late afternoon. The only real illumination came from the small lamp clipped to his shoulder, casting a weak circle of yellow light that barely pushed back the darkness. Bryn clicked the lamp to wide beam and stepped into the tunnel entrance. The structure had partially collapsed years ago, probably during one of the big quakes that hit the planet every few months. Chunks of concrete and twisted metal beams created a maze of shadows and hiding spots, perfect places for scavenge to get overlooked. He moved slowly, sweeping his light back and forth across the debris. Most of what he could see was junk, broken pipes, shattered glass, pieces of machinery that had been stripped of anything valuable long ago. But there, half buried under a pile of ice and snow, was something that might be worth investigating. A supply crate blackened with age but still intact. Bryn crouched down with a grunt, his knees protesting the movement. The cold had settled into his joints like an old friend, the kind that never left and always reminded you it was there. He pulled out his crowbar and worked it under the crate's seal. The metal was so cold it burned his fingers even through his gloves. The seal cracked with a sharp snap that echoed off the tunnel walls. Inside the crate was exactly what he'd expected, nothing useful. Some old wiring with split insulation, a power relay that had been shattered beyond repair, and a few bits of metal that might bring a credit or 2 if he was lucky. Barely worth the effort it had taken to open the thing. He let out a long breath. That immediately turned into a white cloud in the freezing air. His lips were cracked and sore, and he didn't even have the energy left to curse properly. This was how most of his days ended lately, cold, tired, and empty-handed. Then he heard it. Not the wind, not the sound of metal creaking in the cold. Something else, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. A breath, soft and weak, but definitely there. Bryn froze, every muscle in his body going tense. He listened hard, trying to filter out the constant noise of the storm. There it was again, a faint, broken exhale that sounded almost human. But that was impossible. Nobody else was crazy enough to be out here in weather like this. Nobody else was left on this sector of the planet, period. He'd been alone out here for months. The sound came a third time. And now he was sure there was someone else in this tunnel with him. He rose slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the knife on his belt. 6 years of isolation had taught him to be careful. Sometimes the mind played tricks, sure, but sometimes the dangers were real. Pirates, claim jumpers, or worse, people who'd been alone too long and had lost their grip on sanity. Bryn swept his lamp across the tunnel, the beam dancing over broken concrete and twisted metal. At first, he didn't see anything unusual, just more debris, more shadows, more of the same junk that filled every abandoned space on this planet. Then the light caught something that made his breath stop in his throat. There, curled up in the shelter of a collapsed wall, was a figure, small, motionless, almost completely buried under a layer of snow that had drifted in through the broken ceiling. At first glance, it looked like just another piece of debris, maybe an old tarp or some discarded clothing that had gotten covered up. But debris didn't breathe. Bryn moved closer, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. With each step, more details became clear. It was definitely a person, curled up in a tight ball like a child trying to stay warm. But as his light played over the figure, he realized something was very wrong with what he was seeing. The skin that showed through the snow wasn't the right color. He covered the distance between them in 4 quick strides, his heart pounding now. Up close, there was no mistaking what he was looking at. It was a woman, young, from what he could tell, but she definitely wasn't human. Her skin was a soft violet color, almost purple in the harsh light of his lamp. Even under the layer of snow and ice that covered most of her body, he could see patterns of silver running just beneath the surface, like veins made of liquid metal. Her hair was pure white, long and tangled, spread across the ice like spilled starlight. She wasn't wearing any kind of environmental gear. No heavy coat, no insulated boots, no breathing mask. Just a simple tunic that looked like it had been torn and shredded by the wind. The fabric was frozen stiff, and he could see patches of her strange violet skin through the rips. Her arms were wrapped tightly around her ribs, fingers pressed against her sides like she was trying to hold herself together. Those fingers were long and delicate, without claws or any of the other features he might have expected from an alien. They were trembling slightly, half buried in the snow that had drifted around her. Frostbite was already starting to show on her lips, turning them a darker shade of purple. But she was still breathing shallow, irregular gasps that sent small puffs of vapor into the cold air. Bryn dropped to one knee beside her, his mind racing. What the hell was she doing out here? How had she survived this long without proper gear? And what species was she? In all his years traveling the outer colonies, he'd never seen anything quite like her. "Hey," he said, his voice coming out rough and hoarse from disuse. "Can you hear me?" She didn't respond, didn't even twitch. Her eyes were open just barely, and he could see that her irises were pale silver, almost white. They caught the light from his lamp with a strange, wet shimmer that was both beautiful and unsettling. He reached out carefully and touched her shoulder. Her skin felt like cold stone under his gloved hand, and he could feel her bones just beneath the surface, sharp and delicate. She didn't flinch at his touch, didn't pull away or show any sign that she was aware of his presence, but she wasn't dead. He could see her chest rising and falling, could hear those soft, broken breaths. Whatever she was, wherever she'd come from, she was still alive. Barely. Bryn didn't hesitate. He couldn't, moving as quickly as his cold, stiffened fingers would allow. He stripped off his flight jacket. It was old and patched, insulated with thermo weave that had seen better days, but it was warm and it was what he had. He wrapped it around her as gently as possible, trying not to jostle her too much in case she had injuries he couldn't see. She weighed almost nothing. When he lifted her, it was like picking up a child, all bones and fragile angles under the soft weight of his jacket. Her head fell back against his arm, white hair spilling over his sleeve like silk. "Come on," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "You're not dying here. Not on my watch." The storm hit him like a physical blow as soon as he stepped out of the tunnel. The wind slammed into his side with enough force to stagger him, and, without his jacket, the cold cut through his shirt like a blade. But he didn't stop, couldn't stop. he shifted her weight in his arms, locking one arm under her knees and pressing her against his chest. She felt impossibly fragile, like she might break if he held her too tightly. But he couldn't afford to be gentle if it meant losing his grip. The journey back to his ship was a nightmare of wind and snow and bitter cold. Every step was a battle. Against the storm, every breath burned his lungs like fire. His muscles ached, his back screamed in protest, and the cold was working its way through his clothes with vicious efficiency. But he didn't stumble. Couldn't afford to. If he went down, they both died. His ship, if the broken wreck embedded in Hangar 6 could still be called a ship, appeared out of the storm like a mirage. It wasn't much to look at. A small cargo hauler that had seen better decades, with hull patches that had patches of their own and systems that failed more often than they worked. But it was shelter, and right now, that was all that mattered. The airlock hissed open with a sound like escaping breath, and stepping inside felt like walking into a tomb that someone had forgotten to seal. The emergency lighting flickered weakly, casting strange shadows on the walls. The heater panel showed red numbers that made his heart sink. 4.6 degrees Celsius and falling, not much warmer than outside. But it would have to do. He carried her through the narrow corridor into the crew cabin, a tiny room that barely qualified as living space. One cot, one overhead light strip, and walls lined with salvage tools and emergency supplies. It wasn't much, but it was home. Bryn laid her down on the cot as carefully as he could, then immediately went to the storage locker. He had one blanket left, just one. The other had been traded away weeks ago for food and fuel. He pulled it out, hesitated for a moment as he looked at her shivering form, then made a decision. The console in the corner flickered to life as he activated it, the encrypted trade link taking a few seconds to establish connection. The black market vendor's catalog scrolled past on the screen: thermal blankets, medical supplies, food rations, all at prices that made his stomach clench. Thermal blankets, unlicensed stock, 240 credits. Bryn stared at the number on his account. Balance: 287 credits. Everything he had left in the world. Those credits were supposed to buy him a power cell recharge and maybe a short hop to Sector 9 where he could trade for supplies. Without them, he was stuck here until he could scavenge enough to afford fuel. He looked back at the woman on the cot. Her breathing was getting shallower, her lips turning a darker shade of purple despite the jacket wrapped around her. 3 seconds. That's how long he hesitated before pressing the confirm button. The console beeped softly. Transfer processed. Account balance: 47 credits. 10 minutes later, a delivery drone dropped the package through his ship's external hatch, the thermal blanket still steaming from atmospheric burn. Bryn tore it open and activated the warming coils, feeling the fabric heat up in his hands. He pressed it against her chest gently, and for the first time since he'd found her, she reacted. A small twitch, barely noticeable. Her mouth opened slightly, letting out a soft, wet sound that might have been an attempt at speech. "It's okay," he said quietly, kneeling beside the cot. His voice sounded strange in the small space. He wasn't used to talking to anyone, even himself. "You're safe now. Don't try to move." He wrapped the thermal blanket around her shoulders and tucked it close to her body, then positioned her nearer to the emergency heater. The warming plate was hot enough to burn skin, so he placed a cloth between it and the blanket, creating a barrier that would let the heat through without causing damage. Her breathing caught, held for a moment that made his heart stop, then released. In a long, shuddering exhale, he watched her eyes flutter shut, her face relaxing slightly as the warmth began to penetrate her frozen body. She was still shivering, but less violently now. Her fingers, which had been clenched into tight fists, slowly began to relax against the blanket instead of digging into the metal floor of the cabin. Bryn sat down heavily on the floor across from her, leaning his back against the opposite wall. His body ached in places he'd forgotten he had, and his skin burned where the cold had gotten through his clothes during the journey back. Without his jacket, the cabin felt even colder than before, but the emergency heater was working overtime now, and the temperature was slowly climbing. He reached into his salvage pack and pulled out a ration bar, one of his last 3. The wrapper crackled as he opened it, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet cabin. He bit off a piece, chewing the tasteless protein slowly, then placed the rest near her hand where she could reach it if she woke up hungry. Outside, the storm continued to rage, wind howling around the broken hull of his ship like a living thing, trying to get in. But inside, for the first time in months, it was quiet in a way that felt peaceful instead of lonely. Bryn studied her face in the dim light, watching as her breathing gradually slowed and deepened. Her eyelids fluttered occasionally, but they didn't open again. In sleep, she looked even younger than he'd first thought, maybe early 20s. If alien aging worked anything like human aging, she looked like someone from a dream, or maybe a half-remembered story from childhood. Beautiful in a way that was completely alien but somehow familiar at the same time. What the hell had she been doing out there? No environmental gear, no boots, no identification, no supplies. Just that torn tunic and those haunted silver eyes. She hadn't spoken a single word since he'd found her, hadn't even acknowledged his presence. She wasn't just alien. She was alone, just like him. Bryn rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand, feeling exhaustion settle over him like a heavy blanket. It would have been easy to shut down, to curl up on the floor and let sleep take him. His body was screaming for rest, and the warmth from the heater was making his eyelids heavy, but he forced himself to stay awake a little longer, watching over her as her breathing settled into a more natural rhythm. Tomorrow, he'd try to figure out who she was, what species she belonged to, how she'd ended up half frozen in an abandoned mining tunnel. Tonight, though, all that mattered was that she hadn't died in the snow, and maybe, just maybe, neither had he. Morning awakening. Bryn woke to the sound of her breathing. It was different now, still shallow, still uneven, but stronger than it had been the night before. More present somehow, like she was actually fighting to stay alive instead of just clinging to life by accident. He opened his eyes slowly, his eyelids sticky from the cold that had settled in the cabin overnight. The emergency heater was still sputtering away beside the cot, its amber light blinking in a pattern that meant it was running low on power. Again, the thing failed more often than it worked, but somehow it had managed to keep running through the night, maintaining just enough heat to keep the worst of the cold at bay. Just enough. That seemed to be the story of his life lately. The woman was still lying under the thermal blanket, barely visible beneath its reflective silver surface. Her long white hair had spilled over the edge of the cot during the night, curling against the metal floor like frozen silk threads. Her violet skin looked warmer now, less blue around the edges, less like she was dying from the inside out. She hadn't moved much since he'd brought her in, but the fact that she was still breathing meant the fight wasn't over yet. Her chest rose and fell in an irregular rhythm that suggested she was dreaming, or maybe just trying to process whatever trauma had led her to that tunnel. Bryn sat up slowly, his spine crackling in protest. The floor hadn't gotten any more comfortable. Overnight, if anything, the cold had made it worse. Every joint in his body felt like it had been frozen solid and then thawed out with a blowtorch. But he'd slept on worse surfaces, and at least this way she'd had the cot to herself. In her condition, sharing the narrow sleeping space would have been more dangerous than helpful. He crossed to the storage unit, his bare feet silent on the cold metal floor. The protein broth concentrate was exactly where he'd left it, a dented tin that looked older than some of the mining equipment outside. The label was mostly worn off, but he could still make out enough text to know it was supposed to be nutritious and filling. Whether it actually was either of those things was debatable, but it was hot, liquid, and sometimes that was enough. He added water from his recycling tank, the same water he'd been filtering and refiltering for months now, but it was clean enough, and stirred the mixture until it thickened into something that might charitably be called soup. The heating plate warmed it slowly, filling the small cabin with a smell that was equal parts metallic and bland. But at least it was something other than the constant silence he'd grown used to. Her eyes opened as he walked back to her side of the cabin. Not wide, just a careful, cautious sliver of silver that seemed to take in everything without giving anything away. She was watching him, he realized. Actually watching him, aware and present in a way she hadn't been the night before. "Can you sit up?" he asked quietly, crouching down beside the cot with the metal cup in his hands. She didn't respond immediately. Didn't nod or shake her head or make any sound at all, but her eyes tracked his movement as he offered her the cup, blinking once, then again, slow and deliberate, like she was processing what she was seeing, then, moving carefully like every muscle in her body ached. She pushed herself upright. Her arms trembled under the effort, and her shoulders shook beneath the thermal blanket, but she managed it. She was stronger than she looked, or maybe just more stubborn. Either way, it was a start. The cup steamed between his hands as he held it out to her. And for the first time since he'd found her, she was truly awake and looking at him with those strange, beautiful eyes. breath hitched in shallow pulls, but she moved like someone who'd fought her way out of worse. Bren didn't reach for her, he let her do it herself. When she was sitting, he extended the cup again. This time she took it. Her hands were so cold that he could feel the chill even through the insulated cup's handle. She brought it to her lips cautiously, as if unsure it was real. Then she drank a single sip. Her throat worked visibly, then another. Her hand shook. She drank too fast, coughed, nearly spilled it. Bryn caught the cup before it slipped. She flinched. He froze, hand still. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "I just don't want you to drop it." She looked at him, not with trust, not yet, but not with the same bone-deep panic as before. He gently let go of the cup, watching as she took another slower sip. Her lips were still cracked, her skin marked with fine white lines, cold burns, frost scars, and starvation etched into her bones. But her breathing was stronger now, focused. He moved back, giving her space. "Name's Bryn," he said after a beat. "Bin Cutter, ex-pilot." Not much else. No answer, just the quiet sipping of broth. He didn't push it. Instead, he moved to the back of the cabin and started rummaging through the emergency pack. His gear was dwindling. Water, tablets, backup flares, a heat coil that hadn't worked into years. He'd been trading more and more for food lately. The extra thermal blanket he gave her was supposed to be bartered for fuel. There was no backup plan now, just this moment. He glanced over his shoulder. She was staring at the empty cup, holding in both hands as if it was something precious. He stepped back to her side. "There's more if you want it." She hesitated, then nodded. That single motion, it hit him harder than it should have. Didn't know her name, didn't know her species, didn't even know if she'd survive the next 3 days. But the way her fingers clung to that battered cup like it was the first warmth she'd known in years, that he understood. He made her another. This time she took it more slowly. As she drank, Bren moved around the ship, checking the heater's core and the atmospheric seal. He made notes of where the thermal tape had begun to peel near the port hatch. If another storm rolled in, they'd be cutting it close. Again he paused when he heard a sound behind him, a whisper, soft shuffle. She was trying to stand careful, he said, turning. "You've been out in that cold too long, your muscles." She stood anyway, wobbly but upright. The blanket slipped from her shoulders, pulling at her ankles were nothing but that tattered tunic. Her legs were mottled with pale bruises and frost scars. Her knees bent with each shaky breath, but she remained on her feet, and her eyes, those silver-lit, two bright eyes, stared at him with a quiet, almost defiant steadiness. Bren didn't move. She took one step, then Anather stumbled, caught herself on the wall. He didn't reach out. Whatever she had been through, she wasn't ready for touch. Note yet. She made it to the window and stopped there, one hand on the rim, looking out through the frost-caked glass. The outside world was still blinding. White storms still clawing at the ship shoal like a living thing. She stared for a long time, then slowly, almost imperceptibly, she leaned her forehead against the glass. Then finally spoke. "You get a name?" No response. He waited. Seconds passed. Then her fingers lifted, shaky, unsure. She pointed to the condensation on the window. Slowly she traced for letters. "R.I." Bren tilted his head. "Ryan," he echoed. Softly. She didn't nod, didn't smile, but her hand stilled on the glass and her shoulders lowered a fraction. Bren stepped back, giving her distance again. He moved to the heater, checked its readings, dropping. "Damn thing wouldn't last through the night." He looked at Ryan, still standing but visibly weakening. She needed rest, warmth, food, and he needed to make a decision. He had one emergency left, buried under the floor panel with his spare reactor tool. It could be traded for food or sold for fuel, or he crouched down and pried up the hidden panel, staring at the black cartridge nestled there. Every survival instinct told him to save it. Instead, he powered the secondary heating grid. The cabin hummed slowly. The temperature rose. Ryan turned from the window and stared at him, just stared. He met her gaze. "I'm not letting you freeze," he said. "Not again." The words hung between them. "Not just about imperature." "Not really." She lowered herself back to the cot without a sound, pulled the blanket over her knees, and this time when he sat down across from her, she didn't flinch, she didn't speak. But when he passed her a water pouch, she took it without hesitation. That was enough. Tomorrow they'd need to scavenge again, maybe find someone still trading in the west sector, maybe try to reactivate the comms. But for now, he leaned back against the wall, listening to the heater hum and her breath slow. And for the first time in 6 long bitter years, Bryn Cutter didn't feel entirely alone, not anymore. When Bryn opened his eyes, he wasn't sure at first what had pulled him from sleep. The silence, maybe, or the stillness, the kind-off stillness that only existed in 2 places: graveyards and star-forsaken mining stations. For a moment, disoriented in the dim orange light of the heater coil. He thought she'd vanish, that maybe he'd imagined it all a hallucination born from hunger and too many nights spent listening to the storm whisper his name. But then he saw Harrian curled on the cot, her blanket rising and falling in slow, steady rhythm. Her breathing had evened out sometime during the night, less shallow, more human, or more alive. The realization hit him harder than he expected. He didn't move right away, just watched the delicate talent of her jaw, the way the faint heat flushed her violet skin a few shades warmer where the light hit it. Her long white hair had spread across the pillow like frost traced on black glass. Pale, strange, otherworldly, beautiful in a way. He didn't have language, for he looked away. There was work to do. Quietly, Bryn pushed himself off the floor, wincing. A scold shot up his spine. His joints cracked from the awkward angle he'd slept in, back pressed against the walk, knees half bent. The space was never meant for two. It hadn't even been meant for one. Not really, but you may do. That's what survival was making do. He checked the power cell status. 27%. Enough to run the heater for another few hours if he rationed. Not enough to power the cummeray, let alone the booster. That meant no signal, no help. Not yet. His stomach growled as he bent to retrieve a ration cube from the sealed storage tin. He tore it open and popped a chunk in his mouth, chalky, slightly metallic, but edible. He turned at a faint sound. Behind him, a soft rustle of cloth. Ryan had shifted. She was watching him, no longer dazed, no longer half aware. Her silver eyes were fully open now, bright and reflective in heater glow. Alert, quiet, assessing. He swallowed the dry bite in his mouth and cleared his throat. Morning, he said softly. I think. A moment passed, then unexpectedly her lips parted. Is it? She asked. Her voice was raw, dry, as if the word had torn its way out, but her accent, subtle, smooth, barely different from his own, was unmistakably fluent. She spoke standard. Bren blinked, surprised more by the fact that she spoke at all than by the question itself. Technically, no, he replied after a beat. No sunshine, just a lot of white. You get used to not knowing when the day starts. She studied him a moment longer, then sat up slowly, shoulders trembling. As she rose, the blanket slipped down her arm, revealing the bruises at her elbows, the faded frost scars trailing her collarbones. She didn't flinch this time when the air kissed her skin, just adjusted the blanket and held it tighter around herself, then moved carefully to the heat plate, pouring melt water into a steel mug and setting it down to boil. I made something like tea, he said. Don't expect it tastes like metal and burnt plastic, but it's warm. He held the mug out toward her. She stared at it, then at him, then she reached out and took it. Her fingers brushed, as in the exchange, still cool but no longer brittle. She cradled the mug like it meant something, like it had weight beyond function. He sat back on the crate opposite, her arms resting on his knees. They drank in silence for a while. The tea was bitter. He watched her wince faintly at the taste, but continued drinking anyway. Your name? He said, when she set the mug down. Ryan, that's what you wrote. She nodded. I'm Bren Cutter, he offered, former cargo pilot freelancer, now resident of nowhere in particular. Ryan tilted her head slightly. Why are you here? He looked at her, half smiling. Funny, I was going to ask you the same thing. I asked first, she said. Her tone wasn't mocking, just factual, but it caught him off guard again. The way she spoke with that soft precision felt practiced, like she was relearning how to shape thoughts aloud. Bren rubbed his jaw. I crash landed, he said, eventually, 6 years ago. Systems fried in a wide out beacon was dead. Rescue stopped running this far after the war, and nobody trades in this sector unless they're smuggling. Or I stayed on him. He hesitated, then added, I stay because it was simpler. I built what I needed, kept the heaters working, found old supply caches in the tunnels. Figure out if I couldn't leave, maybe I'd make peace with being here. Her gaze didn't waver. Did you? Bren laughed once, not even close. That earned the faintest flicker at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but close. He leaned back, resting against the wall. The heater's quiet hum filled the space between them. In you? He asked. Why were you out there? Nagir, no signal, not even a beacon flare. She went quiet again, her hands tightened around the mug, her shoulders curled slightly inward. I was left behind, she said, voice low during the withdrawal. My name was on the wrong list. No one came back. Ben's stomach sank. They thought you were dead. No, she said. They knew. They just didn't care. There was no anger in her tone that made it worse. Ben sat in that silence for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded thermal patch. Here, He said it's not much, but if you stick it under the blanket it'll help hold in the heat. She took it with both hands, careful, almost reverent. Her fingers brushed his again, longer this time, deliberate, and this time she didn't let go immediately. He looked at her, she looked back. In those quiet seconds a shift happened, not big, not dramatic, just a subtle recalibration of gravity between them. When she pulled away it was slow, measured. She tucked the patch under the blanket, then settled back on the cot, keeping her eyes on him. Bren leaned forward slightly. If you want, he said, you can rest again. I'll stay up. The scanner's been twitchy. I need to keep an eye on it anyway. Ryan didn't move. You're not afraid of me, she said. He blinked. No, he replied. Should I be? You're human, she said. Like the tech explained everything. He met her eyes. So are you? A beat passed. Then no, she said. I'm not. He didn't argue, just nodded slowly. Well, he said, your hair you wear. Breathing, that counts for something. She laid back, pulling the blanket to her chin. Her eyes remained open, and this time, when the heater clicked off and the cold crept in through the seams of the ship's hull, she didn't curl away from him. She stayed, facing him, eyes steady, unblinking, and when she finally blinked it was because sleep had claimed her, not fear. Ben watched her chest rise and fall for a while longer, then leaned back against the wall and let himself breathe for the first time in years. He wasn't waiting for the silence to swallow him. Someone else was here to break it. The heater's glow still painted the walls with dim orange light. When Bren opened his eyes she had meant to fall asleep again, not fully but sometime between. Counting the cracks in the dome and the rhythm of Friend's breathing softening, he must have drifted. She was sitting upright now, blanket wrapped loosely around her shoulders. Her posture had changed, calmer but not relaxed. Her eyes were fixed on a frosted window, though her gaze seemed far past it. Bryn pushed himself upright, joints stiff, mind slow. You sleep? He asked. She nodded faintly. Enough. There was something in her voice. Not broken, not cold, to strip down. Honest. Bryn rose, rubbed the back of his neck and crossed to the heater. The tea he'd left in a mug was cold. He poured fresh water, dropped it in a cube of concentrate, and set it back on the plate. No words passed between them as it warmed. It felt like something was waiting, sitting between them. Not tension, not quite. A kind of breath held too long. She broke at first. There's a part of me, she said, that thought I'd never speak again. Not because I couldn't, because I didn't think it mattered anymore. He looked at her, not pushed, just listened. I was married, she said. The words settled into the quiet like stones into still water. Villain. She continued. He was everything a diplomat should be, calm, unafraid of difficult truths. He believed the war could be ended through language. She turned toward him now, her expression unreadable, her voice steady. High boarded a transport to negotiate one of the last ceasefires. He was the only violin on a human diplomatic vessel. He never made it back. Bren's throat tightened. They told me it was sabotage, that the mission was compromised, a joint tragedy. She gave a hollow laugh. No one took responsibility. The records vanished, the witnesses disappeared, and suddenly being his wife made me a liability. She drew the blanket tighter. They didn't arrest me, didn't exile me officially, just made sure I had nowhere to go. My name was quietly removed from every registry, reassigned to a dead station, left behind. Silence stretched deep and full. I didn't die because of them, she said. I survived despite them. But I stopped speaking because I thought Noon would ever listen. Brendan, speak right away. Then slowly, he crouched near the heater, poured the now steaming tea into a cup, and held out to her. She accepted it without hesitation this time. I'm listening, he said. Her fingers trembled just slightly as she took a sip. Then she looked up at him. What about you? What were you before all this? Bren leaned back against the wall. Cargo pilot, freelancer, mostly legal work, some not so much. I ran routes between disputed zones. When things started getting bad, I signed a contract to do discreet transports, mostly evac, sometimes delivery of aid. He exhaled. One run went wrong. We were dropping supplies to a civilian cluster near the frost line. Orders changed mid-flight, told us to redirect to a higher value zone. The people we were supposed to help, virulent refugees, they were left behind. Some died in the snow. Her eyes stayed locked on his. I tried Torg. Didn't matter. My name ended up on the list of those who carried out protocol without deviation. After Tha's job stopped coming and the guilt didn't. So you came here, she said. I came here to fix my ship, he replied. But I stayed because I thought maybe I didn't deserve to leave. He paused. until I found you. She didn't look away. And now I'm not so sure what I deserve, but I know what I want. She set the cup down carefully. Her hands were steadier now. She rose, walked slowly to the other side off the small cabin, and opened one of the old data drawers inside. Buried beneath a tangle of cracked casings was a single hardened data crystal. She brought it to him and held it out. "This is everything Van gave me," she said, before his final trip. "Names, orders, internal memos from both governments. The truth." Bryn stared at it. "Why give it to me?" "Because you're the first person who hasn't tried to take it," she said. "And I'm tired of carrying it alone." He took the crystal. It was light in his hand, too light for what it held. "I don't know what to do with it," he admitted. She stepped back, sat again on the cot. "You don't have to know, just don't let it be erased." They sat there a while longer, not needing to fill the silence anymore. The world outside the dome remained harsh and different, but inside, something else had taken root. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe finally the beginning of something worth fighting for. And this time neither of them would face it alone. The storm outside had shifted, not gone. Navar 7 never went quiet, but it had thinned to a steady whisper. The sky beyond the dome was a pale uniform, gray like the world had exhaled, but wasn't done grieving. Inside the shelter, Rian steered from light sleep. Her back cracked as she sat up, muscles stiff from the cold and tension. She didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. Bren was already awake, crouched by the control panel, rerouting power. A coil of wire slooped from the auxiliary feed into the old beacon array. It shouldn't have worked, not with parts this old, but somehow, under his fingers it did. "I can feel you thinking," she murmured. He didn't turn. "Bad habit comes from not having anyone else to talk to." Ryan swung her legs off the cot and pulled on her boots. They were too big, borrowed from a minning locker he'd salvaged 2 winters ago, but she wore them like she meant to survive. "We can't stay here much longer. Hesitate, the heater's on borrowed time. Power is draining faster than I can replace it." She stepped beside him, gazing at the flickering signal indicator. "You've been trying to fix that transmitter since before I got here," she said. "Yeah, but now I've got a reason to finish the job." Her eyes met his calm, clear, not dramatic declarations. "Just understanding." They worked in silence for a while. She adjusted the antenna alignment while he fine-tuned the signal pulse. Outside, Fuin picked up again, rattling the dome like a beast, testing the walls of Cage Outpost West. "Might still have a working booster," Bren said after a minute. "Old tree hub abandoned before the collapse. If the relay is intact, we can piggyback a call to the upper orbit lanes and risk being tracked," she said. "They are greedy looking," he replied. "But now we have something they want." His gaze drifted to the data crystal on the tablerian, followed it, then looked back at him. "You're sure about this?" "I'm sure about you," he said simply. She died interruptly. Instead, she turned toward the gear pile and began packing. Thermal blanket, spare battery, a few protein cubes, the blade she always kept close. They moved with efficiency, 2 survivors who'd learned to prepare without talking it through. But as Bren sealed the last clasp on his bag, he hesitated, then glanced up. "You don't flinch anymore," he said. Ryan paused. "Is that good? It means you trust me." She shouldered her pack. "Or I've just run out of options." He smiled. Same difference. They left the shelter before full daylight, if such a thing existed here. The light was thin, diffused through cloud and ice like memory through grief. Their path wound through snow drifts, broken walkways and collapsed towers. Ghosts of station built for cooperation and left to rot in silence. No one spoke. There was no need. Midway through the trek, Bren paused and pointed toward the horizon. A faint structure rose from the snow like a broken tooth. "West Relay," he said, still standing. Ryan narrowed her eyes. Not alone. He followed her gaze. Tracks fresh, not deep. Scout tread. Maybe 1 or 2 people. Light footprints that disappeared behind a ridge. Bren tensed. Could be scavengers, could be worse. She murmured. They approached carefully, keeping low. At the edge of the outpost plaza, Bryn ducked behind a rusted fuel tank and scoped the area. Movement just beyond the relay's base tower. Tow figures. Light armor, black and gray. Not scavengers. He swore under his breath. Corporate sweepers. Small unit. Recon, not strike yet, Ryan said. They slipped into a maintenance tunnel behind the tower, hearts pounding, steps careful. Inside it was colder than outside. The relay station still groaned with the wind, but the noise here was deeper. Metal settling, steams failing. A place that knew it was forgotten. They reached the sub-control panel. Bren crouched, pulled the casing free and stared at the brutal wiring. I can reroute, push a burst out, but if they're monitoring for pings, they'll know. Ryan nodded. Then make it count. He worked quickly, hands steady. The beacon lit. A single tone echoed through the hull. A synthetic heartbeat. Sent into space outside. Boots struck the metal walkway. They were out of time. Back tunnel, Ryan said, pointing. Old air duct drops behind a ridge. He didn't argue. They ran. Bren hit the corner first, then froze. Another figure. Different armor, not recon. Von Ryan's breath caught. Her steps faltered. He saw her and smiled. So did Bren. Then he grabbed her hand and ran the other way. They didn't make it far. The tunnel dropped them just beyond the ridge, close enough to see the relay tower silhouetted against the pale sky, but far enough to feel like they'd slipped behind the edge of the worldwide. Hissed across the snow, low and steady. Ben knelt and scanned the horizon. Signal took. It's out there, no, he said. If anyone's listening, they'll hear it. Ryan stood beside him, still as a statue. Her eyes weren't on the horizon. They were fixed behind them. Followed, she said. Ben turned and saw him, a lone figure crossing the white knoll. No rush. His long coat rippled behind him like a flag. Snow didn't slow him. Neither did time. Cale Vaughn, the strategist who had orchestrated her erasure. Not in the files, not in the kill reports, but behind it all, her husband's death, the silence afterward, that lightning, noose around, every name that remembered. Bren reached for his weapon, an old pulse pistol, half-charged maybe, good for one shot. Don't, Ryan said. Her voice was calm, measured. He wants us scared, standing still. Vaughn stopped 10 paces from them. You made this more difficult than it needed to be. He called, not shouting, just speaking as if this were a meeting, not a manhunt. No one invited you, Brennan replied, leveling the pistol. Vin's eyes flicked to him. Ah, the pilot, the repairman, the fool who fell in love with a corpse. Someone forgot to bury. Rand didn't react. Bren did. His jaw clenched, but head didn't fire. Why now? Ryan asked, stepping forward. 6 years you let me rot. I let you vanish, Vaughn corrected. You weren't supposed to outlast the system. And villain? She asked. What was he? Collateralvin said one word. Enough. Bren moved first, but Ryan was faster. She didn't charge. She closed. Precise, sudden, silent. Her blade was out before Vaughn's hand reached his coat, but he wasn't unarmed. A narrow shock baton snapped from his sleeve. He parried, twisted, drove her back with brutal efficiency, not trained for elegance, trained to end. Bren fired. Theppel shot missed, but not by much. Vin turned. That was the opening. Ryan's second strike cut low across the thigh, a clean line. Blood followed. He hissed, stumbled back, regained footing. You still don't understand, he said, breath sharp. You don't matter. The truth you carry doesn't matter. They'll bury it again. Then bury me with it, Ryan said. She struck again. Blade met baton. Sparks flew. This wasn't a fight between equals. It was a reckoning. Bren moved to flank. No words, no warning. He came in low, shoulder first, driving Vernon off balance. They fell hard, wrestling in the snow. The pistol skidded from his grip. Ryan reached. At first she didn't aim at Vaughn's chest. She aimed at the leg. He was favoring the pulse blast, took him down. He screamed, rolled, but didn't rise. Bryn staggered to his feet, breath ragged. You want to kill him? Ryan stared at the man on the ground, his coat soaked with blood, his eyes wide, not with pain but fury. No, she said. I want him to live. I want him to watch. She pulled the data crystal from her coat and held it up. It's already gone. Uploaded. Distributed. You lost. You tried to rise. She pressed the pistol to his shoulder and fired again. He dropped unconscious. They left him there. By the time they returned to the ridge, the wind had changed, sharper, no-curling with urgency. The transmitter light blinked green. Inbound signal confirmed. Bren looked at her. They're coming. She nodded. I know. He hesitated. You don't have to go with me. Ren turned to him, her expression unreadable. Neither do you. But I will, he said. That earned the smallest smile. Then we go together. She took his hand. No ceremony. Just truth in them. The snow would bury the blood, the wreckage, the Man who once believed silence was stronger than survival. Ahead for the first time was something else, a future, and no one would take it from them. The snowstorm had eased, leaving behind a broken silence like the world had run out of breath. The signal beacon blinked steady green against the frozen skyline, pulsing through the last haze of morning frost. Rand stood at the edge of the outpost's landing platform, wind tugging at her goat, silver eyes fixed on the sky. The old relay tower groaned behind her, bent but still standing like everything else here. She didn't speak, not yet. She didn't thave to. Bryn stood a few paces away, scanning the horizon through half-frozen goggles. His pulse was steady now, but only because it had to be. He turned to her. 6 minutes, he said. She nodded. They both knew what that meant. The shuttle was inbound. Civilian registry, unaffiliated, drawn in by the wide burst call Bran had triggered from the relay hours ago. The one carrying a copy of the truth Ryan had bled for. And one Shincheto leave this dead place behind. Bren stepped toward her. You still sure about this? I was sure the moment I gave you the data crystal, she said quietly. I just didn't know what leaving would feel like. And now? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at her boots. Boots still too large, laced with scrap cord worn from the tunnels. It feels like I might still be alive, she said. Bren smiled faintly. You are? She looked up, meeting his gaze. And you? What does this mean for you? He hesitated, then shrugged. I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. His eyes softened. I came here looking for Arison to leave. Turns out I found a reason to stay human. The words settled between them, quiet but whole. From the hill behind the platform, the wind shifted again, and with it the sound of a small engine. The shuttle, low profile, matte hull, no logos, civilian, just like they'd hoped, but still Bren's hand dropped instinctively to his belt. The pistol was gone. Didn't need it now, but the reflex was hard to break. Ryan watched as the ship descended, its landing thrusters kicking up a flurry of ice and wind. When the door opened, a single figure stepped out. Human, mid-40s, short, weary, wrapped in a parka that had seen better days. She raised one gloved hand. You cut her. I am. Bren said you put out a wide burst. Got something about war crimes? Diplomatic. Fraud Council obstruction. Real light reading. Bren didn't flinch. We have the original files. They're duplicated and encoded into the wide burst. You don't need us for the story. The woman tilted her head. No, but I figure I owe the truth to whoever paid the price for it. Her eyes shifted to Ryan. And you are? Rian stepped forward. The one who didn't stay dead. There was no triumph in her voice, no bitterness, just fact. The pilot studied her for a long beat, then nodded. We've got med supplies, food, heat. Not much, but better than this. She turned back toward the shuttle. If your Readirian looked once more at the outpost behind her, not for nostalgia, for finality, the snow-covered corridor where she'd almost died, the dome where they'd almost frozen. The relay tower that had finally spoken their names back to the stars. She turned away. Bren reached out, his fingers brushing hers. I'm not asking for a promise, he said. Just space beside you, wherever this leads. Ryan met his hand halfway, laced her fingers through his. That's all I want, she said. They walked together toward Theopan ramp, the wind swirled behind them, cold and familiar, but it didn't reach inside. The shuttle took off 20 minutes later, quiet and armed, just another rust bucket moving through dead air. But for the first time in years, Ben didn't feel like he was drifting, and Ren didn't feel like she was disappearing. They sat side by side in the back cabin, watching frost gather on the edge of the window. The planet below shrank inch by inch. That haunted slab of ice war and Silencephaly behind them. Ahead, that was the strange part. There was no plan, no mission, nowhere to run from or justice to chase, just possibility. A soft tone broke the quiet, a message flashing across the shuttle's comm screen. Received full archive, confirmed, distributed to 37 nodes, confirmed playback by independent network. Rian stared at the words for a long moment, then shut her eyes. She hadn't done it for vengeance. She had done it because Seedly had taken everything, and the truth, it didn't return what she'd lost, but it gave someone else a chance, not to lose the same. Later, Bren found her leaning against the wall near the rear airlock, staring out at the stars. Hess stepped beside her, not speaking. She looked over. It's strange, she said. Tost'll be afraid of peace. Peace is harder, Bren said. Takes longer to learn. She gave a quiet laugh. So what do we do now? He looked at her. Now we heal, he said. Now we build something no one gets to race. She reached for his hand again, gently. Not a rescue, not a debt, just presence. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. And this time no would be left behind. The shuttle touched down with barely a sound, a soft hiss of pressure. Release the artificial gravity adjusting. Then silence. Ryan stepped out first, boots meeting sun-warm stone. Notice not broken steel, just clean, dry ground. Pale blue sky above, filter through a light dome, but open enough to see real light, not flicker strips, not frost glow. Bren followed, blinking. Against the sunlight, they were in a small arrival district just outside of Meridia Prime, one of the core colonies rebuilt after the ceasefire. Glass paneled towers rose on the edge of the horizon, but here there were trees, real ones, low and wind-shaped, swaying in air that didn't smell like rust or survival, it smelled like life. They didn't speak right away, they just breathed. That alone was a kind of freedom. The local medic had checked them quickly, offering supplies and warmth, and no questions, no branding scans, no registry chains, just a quiet nod from a woman who knew the look of people who'd been hunted too long. You're cleared, she'd said. No one's following, not anymore. And that was it. Be midday. Ryan and Bran had moved into a temporary flat, small, clean, sunlit, nothing like the rusted out cabins of Navarra 7. It had a working shower, real food, and walls that didn't creak. With wind, they spent the day walking, not with purpose, just walking. Ryan's fingers brushed over the bark of a tree as if it were holy. She knelt to touch the soil, odd, soft, short, but real. When a child's toy drone zipped past her and made her flinch, the child apologized. Ryan only smiled. Ben bought 2 hotties from a street stall just because it was there. They sat on a bench near a fountain. Water, real water, running freely for hours. Neither said much, but the silence was different now, not survival net. Retreat, just space shared. When dusk came, they returned to the flat. He opened the door for her and she stepped inside without hesitation. No tension, no ghosts in the corners, just stillness and the knowing that for the first time they weren't looking over their shoulders. That night it began with stillness, not the kind of silence that weighed with dread, but something softer, slower, like the world outside had finally run out of reasons to interrupt them. They had returned to the small flat hours. Earlier, the sun had dipped low behind Meridia's southern rim, casting a warm amber glow across the window's artificial atmosphere hummed steadily in the background. Unbroken, clean. Brennan had taken the first real shower in years. When he stepped out, he found Ryan on the edge of the bed, unbraiding her long white hair with fingers that moved almost shyly. She wore a simple tunic, now soft and loose. A scar that crossed her collarbone caught the light. He froze in the doorway, not because of her body, but because of her ease, her being there in a room in the open, unafraid. She looked up, met his ease, and smiled. No performance, no invitation, just acknowledgement. I didn't think I'd ever feel clean again, she said softly, running a hand through her hair. But today I do. Bren approached, low towel draped around his neck. He sat beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her body without touching. Funny, he said. I didn't think I'd ever feel human again. Ryan reached out, their fingers brushing lightly along his jaw. She traced the stubble, the old scare above his brow. You never stopped being human, she murmured. You just forgot how it felt to be touched like one. Had turned to her, then not in hunger, in recognition. Their kiss was slow, the kind that happens not because of need but because of relief, because you've waited long enough and now you don't have to. Her hand slid into his damp hair. His fingers found the curve of her waist lingering at the hem of her tunic. She pressed into him, small gasps escaping between breaths, not from fear, never again, but from rediscovery. Ren guided him back, her body easing over his with a grace that came not from seduction but certainty. Bryn stared up at her. The light behind her turned her violet skin into a painting of dusk. Her long white hair tumbled forward, brushing his shoulders. She looked down at him as if he were the first steady thing she'd found after years of falling. And he led her. He let her lead because she needed to reclaim something, and he was willing to be the place where that reclamation began. Her hips moved slowly, searching for rhythm, not fast, not rushed, like she wanted to feel everything, like every shift, every breath, every shared inch of skin was a word in a language they were building together. Brennan's hands gripped her thighs, anchoring himself in the gravity of her. She arched back, a low sound slipping from her throat, half surprise, half pleasure. The kind of sound made when something finally fully fits, not just physically, but entirely. She leaned down again, forehead pressed to his, her breath warm against his mouth. I've never, she whispered. He kissed the edge of her jaw. Me neither. Her laugh, breathy, unsure, dissolved into a moan. Ash shifted beneath her, his mouth grazing the soft slope of her neck, his hands reverent, not claiming but cherishing. There was no performance between them, only permission. She moved with increasing rhythm, now bolder, more assured, each motion echoing the trust that had taken weeks to form battles. Toferjben held her close as she came undone above him, breath trembling, body shivering, not from cold but release. Years of holding herself rigid finally melting into something warm, open, real. He followed her, slower, deeper, his arms wrapped tight around her back. When he whispered her name, it was not in lust but gratitude. They stayed that way, angled skin to skin, the world narrowing to the soft sounds of recovery. Later, when the air had cooled and the room had dimmed, re-incurred into his chest, fingers trailing lazy circles along his arm. I didn't think I'd ever want to be seen again, she said. He brushed her hair from her cheek. Then I'm honored to be the one who does. She smiled into his skin. I don't want this to be survival anymore. It's not, he said. It's home. They fell asleep with limbs entwined and knolls between them. Not between their bodies, not between their hearts. Whatever came next, they would meet it like this, chosen awake together.